settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let us journey together to a time of myth and legend. A time when the galaxy was aflame with civil war, when brother turned against brother, and when the fate of all humanity hung upon the edge of a blade. This is the story of the Siege of Terra. But before the siege, there came the war. A war fought across the entirety of the solar system, across millions of kilometers of void, around moons and planets that had been humanity's home for 10,000 years. A war that would determine whether there would be a siege at all, or whether Terra would fall without the Warmaster ever setting foot upon its soil. This is the story of the solar war. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But in this moment, at the turning of the 31st millennium, that war had come home at last. Before we speak of ships and guns and dying worlds, we must speak of another battlefield, one that exists beyond the veil of reality in the roiling madness of the warp. Here, in this place where time has no meaning and thought becomes substance, two figures faced each other across a dying fire. The first was a man, or at least, he wore the shape of one. He sat upon the frozen ground of a winter forest, his clothes ragged and worn, his face lined with age and weariness. Before him, a small fire flickered and guttered, its light barely enough to hold back the pressing darkness of the trees. He was the Emperor of mankind, Master of Terra, the last and first Lord of the Imperium. But here, in this place of symbols and meaning, he chose to appear as simply a man beside a fire humanity itself, alone against the night. The second figure prowled at the edge of the firelight. It wore many forms: a wolf with silver fur and knowing eyes, a shadow vast and hungry, a king in black robes with gems glinting on his fingers. This was Horus, the Warmaster, once the greatest of the Emperor's sons, now the vessel of chaos itself. And behind him, just beyond the failing light, other shapes moved and whispered, things of feather and scale and bone, gods of nightmare and hunger that had claimed Horus for their own. "I am returned," said the wolf, its voice carrying the promise of endings. "I deny you," replied the man beside the fire. And for a moment the flames leaped higher, driving back the darkness. For a moment the shadows retreated. But only for a moment. This battle in the warp, this eternal confrontation between the light of humanity's hope and the darkness that sought to consume it, had been going on since before the first ship of Horus's fleet had breached the outer reaches of the solar system. It would continue throughout everything that followed, a war within a war, fought in the space between heartbeats and the depths of dreams. The Emperor was fighting on 100 fronts at once. His attention was divided between the golden throne that sustained the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided humanity's ships through the warp, the defense of Terra itself, and this deeper, more fundamental conflict against powers that had existed since the first sentient being had looked into the darkness and felt fear. He was losing, not quickly, not obviously. But bit by bit, the fire was dying and the wolves were drawing closer. On the first day of Primus, in the year 14 of the 31st millennium, the sirens began to sound across Terra. It was an old tradition, this counting of days. On the myriad worlds conquered and ruled by the Imperium of Man, time was measured differently, sliced into 1,000 equal portions, numbered and standardized, stripped of any character or meaning. First division, second division, third, and so on, until the weight of counting reached 1,001 year tipped over into the next. On worlds of endless night or blinding perpetual day, a year was the same as any other. But here, on the world whose night and day and seasons had given mankind its very concept of time, the old counting still meant something. The first of Primus, the firstborn of 365 days to follow, had always been the Feast of Two Faces, the day of new light, the renewal. It had been a day of hope and new beginnings since before humanity had learnt to write. Not this year. This year, the first day of Primus was marked not with celebration but with the wail of warning sirens. The sirens began on the palace spires, their voices electronic and inhuman, crying out across the fortress continent that crowned the Himalayan mountains. One siren became 2, then 10, then 100. The cry picked up and passed along until it spread across the turning globe. It echoed through mountain-sized spaceports and rasped from vox horns in the deep strata of hive cities. It reached into the Atlantean arcologies beneath the poisoned seas and the scattered settlements that clung to the few habitable zones beyond the palace walls. On and on the sound went, stilling the hands of people as they ate and worked. They looked up, not at the ceiling or the sky, but at each other, seeing their own fear reflected in a stranger's eyes. In caves beneath the earth and hive vaults that had never known sunlight, in water markets and manufactorum shifts and refugee camps, swollen with the displaced, they heard that sound and knew what it meant. "He is here," they whispered. "The Warmaster has come." And in the northern battlements of the imperial palace, where snow fell in gentle silence, 3 demigods watched the night sky and waited for the war to begin. Rogel Dawn stood like a statue carved from gold and stone, his armor gleaming in the dim light of distant stars. He was the Praetorian of Terra, the Primarch of the Imperial Fist's Legion, and the architect of every fortification, every defense line, every desperate stratagem that stood between Horus and victory. 7 years he had prepared for this moment. 7 years of endless work, of hard choices and harder sacrifices. Now the moment had come, and all he could do was watch. Beside him stood Sanguinius the Angel, Primarch of the Blood Angels. His wings, great white pinions that marked him as something more than merely superhuman, were folded against his back, their feathers ruffling in the cold wind. Of all the Emperor's sons, Sanguinius was perhaps the most beautiful, his features perfect in a way that made mortal artists weep with despair. But there was a shadow in his eyes tonight, a weight of prescience that no beauty could disguise, and there was Jagatai Khan, the Warhawk, Primarch of the White Scars. He alone seemed at ease, leaning against the battlements with the studied casualness of a predator at rest. His dark eyes scanned the heavens with an expression that might have been hunger or might have been sorrow. It was difficult to tell with the Khan. "It begins," said Dawn, his voice flat and heavy. Far above them, so distant that they appeared as mere pinpricks of light, new stars were being born in the darkness, stars that were not stars at all, but the flash of weapons and the death of ships. The first battle had begun, and humanity's sons were already dying. "No," said the Khan softly. "It continues. It has always been continuing. This is merely the next movement of a dance that began before any of us were born." Sanguinius said nothing. His eyes were fixed on a point in the sky that the others could not see, watching something that had not yet happened, mourning a death that had not yet occurred. The snow continued to fall, and the sirens continued to wail, and far away in the darkness, the war for the solar system had begun. Far from Terra, at the very edge of the solar system, the defenders had been waiting. The Plutonian Gulf was a region of space so vast that the human mind struggled to comprehend it. From the dim light of Pluto to the boundary where the sun's gravity could no longer hold ships in orbit, the gulf stretched across billions of kilometers of absolute darkness. It was cold here, cold beyond imagining, the background radiation of the universe barely warmed by the distant mote of Sol. It was empty here, or had been, until the defenders arrived. Now the gulf glittered with humanity's defiance. Weapon platforms hung in the void like metallic flowers, their petals arrays of macro cannons and lance batteries, their stems columns of reactor feeds and ammunition hoists. Each platform was a fortress in miniature, capable of crippling a warship with a single well-placed salvo. There were thousands of them, arranged in overlapping patterns that created interlocking fields of fire across millions of kilometers. Between the platforms drifted torpedo shoals, clusters of self-guided warheads, waiting in silent patience for the command to wake. Some were nuclear, some were plasma, some were filled with exotic payloads that defied easy description, virus bombs that could eat through hull metal, haywire generators that could cripple a ship's systems, void mines that tore holes in reality itself. There were millions of them, enough to destroy a fleet, enough to make any approach a nightmare of random death. And beyond the torpedoes lay the minefields, vast drifting clouds of explosive devices that tumbled through the darkness on carefully calculated trajectories. A ship could enter such a field and never emerge, ground to fragments by the endless cascade of detonations. Together, these defenses formed a web tens of thousands of kilometers deep, a barrier that should have been impenetrable to any conventional attack. Ships patrolled this web, fast gun sloops that could dash between the platforms in minutes, monitor vessels that were little more than engines welded to weapons, all built in the orbital forges of Luna and Jupiter and Uranus, then dragged to the edge of the sun's light to stand guard. And at the heart of this web waited the fleet of the First Sphere, hundreds of warships under the command of Lord Castellan Sigismund. Sigismund, first captain of the Imperial Fists, stood upon the command deck of his strike frigate, the Lacrimae, and watched the darkness with eyes that had seen more death than most men could imagine. He was armored, as always. Yellow ceramite encased his frame, the plate scarred by 1,000 battles and repaired 1,000 times. His black sword, the blade that had earned him the title of greatest warrior in the Imperium, was chained to his wrist and rested point down on the deck at his feet. He did not move. He barely seemed to breathe. In the stillness of his mind, words echoed, words spoken by a woman named Keela, who had shown him a path of faith when the galaxy seemed to have abandoned such things. You must choose where to stand, by the words of your duty or by your father's side at the end. He had chosen. He had sought out Euphrati Keela and heard her prophecy, had accepted her vision of a future where the Emperor was not merely a ruler but a god. And for that choice, for that moment of faith over duty, Rogel Dawn had cast him out. "You are not my son," his father had said, his voice cold as the void. "And no matter what your future holds, you never will be." Sigismund had accepted that judgment. He had continued in his rank and position, as Dawn commanded, and he had told no one of the rift between them. He served as he always had, with perfect dedication and perfect skill. But something had changed within him. Some weight had settled upon his shoulders that would never lift. "I chose," he whispered to himself, watching the darkness, "and here I stand at the end." Around him, the command crew waited in tense silence. They knew what was coming. Everyone knew. The pressure had been building for hours, a psychic bow wave that had sent astropaths screaming into madness, that made the skin prickle and the head ache with whispers that seemed to come from just beyond the edge of hearing. Horus was coming. The Warmaster was bringing his entire armada to Terra, the full strength of 9 Traitor Legions and their countless allies. And this moment, this frozen instant of waiting, was the last breath before the storm broke. Etheric surge detected, called a sensor officer, her voice professionally calm despite the terror that had to be clawing at her heart. Sigismund raised his helm from his belt and locked it in place over his head. The display lit in his eyes, overlaying his vision with tactical data threat assessments, firing solutions, fleet positions, all the mathematics of organized violence. "All ships," he said, his voice carrying across the fleet through crackling vox links. "For our oaths, we hold true." And the void tore open. What happened next would be remembered, by those who survived to remember anything, as a vision of hell made manifest. Reality did not merely open, it shattered. Rents appeared in the fabric of space, wounds in the universe itself that bled colors that had no names and should not have existed. Lightning, the hue of bruised flesh, crackled between the tears. Sound emerged where no sound should exist in vacuum, screaming, howling, the laughter of thirsting gods. And through these wounds poured ships. They came in their hundreds, then their thousands. Hulls emerged from the rifts, trailing streamers of ectoplasm and ghost fire, their surfaces crawling with half-visible things that burned away in the light of reality. Some ships came through intact, their crews alive and screaming orders, their weapons already charging. Others came through wrong, twisted, compressed, their hulls folded in on themselves, their crews fused with bulkheads or scattered across impossible geometries. The deaths began immediately. The first wave of ships met the first layer of defenses in a catastrophic exchange of fire. Mines detonated in cascades, each explosion triggering its neighbors, chains of destruction stretching across thousands of kilometers. Weapon platforms opened up with everything they had, macro shells screaming through vacuum at speeds that blurred even augmented vision, lance beams cutting through hulls like hot wire through wax. In the first 10 seconds, over 100 vessels died. They were mostly transports, converted merchant ships crewed by humans who had sworn their oaths to Horus and been rewarded with the honor of being the first to draw their blades in this battle. They burned for that honor. They screamed and died in fire and vacuum, their sacrifice forgotten before their bodies had even stopped twitching. But they served their purpose. They drew fire. They absorbed the initial fury of the defenses, and in the chaos of their death, the true warships of the Traitor Legions emerged. The first Legion vessel to breach was named the Erinyes. She was a bombardment galleon of the Iron Warriors, 5 kilometers of adamantium and hate, her hull wrapped around a trio of Nova cannon barrels that jutted from her prow like the mandibles of some vast predatory insect. She fired all 3 guns the moment she tasted reality. Nova cannon shells were not conventional munitions. Each one was the size of a battle titan, its core filled with unstable plasma contained by magnetic fields that would fail precisely on impact. They had no guidance systems, they didn't need them. At this range, against a target this vast, accuracy was meaningless. The shells ran straight into the heart of the defenses and detonated. For an instant, 3 new suns were born in the darkness of the Plutonian Gulf. The light was so intense that it overwhelmed sensors, blinded augmented eyes, turned the shadows of ships into stark black silhouettes against white fire. The heat was enough to vaporize thousands of tons of metal, to turn minefields into expanding clouds of plasma, to erase weapon platforms from existence as though they had never been. And when the light faded, and the sensors cleared, and the defenders looked upon what remained of their carefully constructed web, they saw the true horror of what they faced. The Traitor fleet was still coming, ship after ship, pouring through the breach in reality, an endless tide of hatred given form. For every vessel that died in the minefields, 3 more took its place. For every volley the defenders fired, the enemy fleet grew stronger. "Engage," said Sigismund, and the Lochrymay leapt forward into the fire. The First Sphere fleet, 200 warships strong, veterans of 100 campaigns, the finest void warriors in the Imperium, threw themselves at the enemy. They attacked in perfect formation, coordinated volleys raking the traitor vessels as they struggled to establish themselves in reality. They killed dozens of ships in the first minutes, their guns finding vulnerable targets, their torpedoes slipping through gaps in the enemy's confused formation. But it was not enough. It could never be enough. The traitors kept coming, and the defenders kept dying, and the light of the Plutonian Gulf began to dim as the dreams of victory burned away. While battle raged at the edge of the system, far from the guns and the dying, a woman named Masadi Olaton woke from troubled dreams. She lay in a metal cell, 3 meters by 2, its walls sweating with condensation that never quite dried. A caged lamp in the ceiling provided the only light, dim and yellowed, casting shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The air was cold and stale, recycled too many times, carrying the faint chemical tang of a ship's life support systems. 7 years. 7 years she had been a prisoner, locked away in the nameless fortress, that secret prison orbiting Titan, where the Imperium kept its most dangerous secrets. 7 years of silence and solitude, of questions never asked, and answers never given, of dreams that cut like knives and waking that brought no relief. She had been a remembrancer once. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to a different person. She had been sent to the stars to witness the Great Crusade, to record the glorious deeds of the Space Marines as they brought humanity's light to a darkened galaxy. She had been assigned to the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, the spearhead of the Emperor's vision, commanded by Horus himself. She had seen things no mortal was ever meant to see. She remembered the lodge meetings held in secret aboard the Vengeful Spirit, where warriors spoke of brotherhood and destiny in voices that grew stranger with each passing month. She remembered the change that came over the Legion after Davin, the silence that fell when certain names were mentioned, the way some brothers walked with shadows that did not match their movements. She remembered the moment she realized that everything she believed about the Imperium, about the Great Crusade, about Horus himself, was a lie. She had escaped, eventually. Loken had helped her, Garviel Loken, the captain who had tried to hold on to his honor, even as everything around him fell into darkness. Together with a handful of others, they had fled the Vengeful Spirit just before the massacre at Istvan III carried word of the betrayal back to Terra. It had saved nothing. The heresy had spread regardless, had consumed the galaxy in fire and blood. And Mercedes, who had seen too much, who knew too many secrets, had been locked away where her knowledge could not cause trouble. 7 years of silence, 7 years of memories that played behind her eyes whenever she closed them. 7 years of wolves circling in her dreams. She pressed her hand against the cold metal wall and felt the vibration, or rather, felt its absence. The engines had stopped. Wherever she was, the ship was no longer moving. Something was happening. Something had changed. And in the depths of her soul, where the wolves lived, she felt them lift their heads and howl. At the heart of the traitor fleet, far from the killing light of the Plutonian defenses, a battle barge named War Oath hung in the darkness. Once she had been a ship of the Imperial Fists, named by the Emperor himself. But those days were long past. Time and treachery had remade her, as they had remade the Legion that commanded her now. Ezekiel Abaddon, first captain of the Sons of Horus, stood in the ship's observatory and watched the distant sun. Ghostlight clung to the hull around him. Daemons whispered at the edge of his hearing. their voices coiling through the bones of the ship before fading to nothing. A being materialized beside him, not physically present, but a psychic projection. Zardu Layak of the Word-Bearers, the Crimson Apostle, whose iron mask was studded with rows of glowing eyes. Candles of human tallow burned around him, their flames flickering with unnatural colors. 8 heaps of ash and blackened bone lay in a circle where his chosen sacrifices had burned during the ship's translation from the warp. "The gods bless us," Layak intoned, "and bring us to the light of truth." Abaddon felt his jaw clench. Part of him wanted to order his Justarin Terminators to open fire and reduce the Word-Bearers to pulped meat and shredded armor. He loathed what they had become, these servants of the dark gods. He loathed more the necessity of using their powers to achieve his father's ends, but necessity was not something that bent to his hatred. "You have faith in the gods?" asked Layak, his voice carrying the static buzz of his mask's vox emitters. "I have faith in our Warmaster," growled Abaddon. It was a careful answer. Abaddon was many things: a killer, a conqueror, a son of Chthoniya, who had risen from the gang wars of that benighted world to become the first captain of the greatest legion, but he was not a fool. He knew the Word-Bearers watched for signs of weakness, for any hint that the sons of Horus were not fully committed to the cause. He knew that the gods they served were always hungry for new followers, new vessels, new souls to consume. He would not give them his. The traitors had done something thought impossible. Through sacrifice and sorcery, through the pouring out of blood and souls into the warp, they had translated their ships past the Mandeville Point, that invisible barrier where a star's gravity made warp travel too dangerous to attempt. Millions had died to make it possible. Tens of thousands had been bled into offering vats or cast from hangar bays into the Immarterium. Most had died with pleas for mercy on their lips. Some had spoken prayers of thanks to the gods they served. The price had been paid, and now the blade was in position. "All ships," said Abaddon, his voice echoing across the void. "By my word, and the word of the Warmaster, the blade falls." One by one, the ships of the traitor vanguard lit their engines and slid toward the waiting sun. On Terra, in the shadowed chambers of the Pab Bastion, Admiral Neora Sukassan took tea with a demigod. The Khan Jagatai, called the Warhawk, Primarch of the White Scars, sat across from her on cushions she had acquired years ago from a merchant in the Chagorian trade. He looked utterly at ease despite his size, arrayed in half-plate and silks, a glass of spiced tea in his massive hands. Her Jayhawk, Kellic, had fluttered from her shoulder to perch on the Primarch's wrist, and the Khan was stroking its crest with obvious delight. "You have doubts about my brother's method of fighting this war," the Khan said. It was not a question. Sukassan considered her response carefully. She had helped devise the battle plans, the ordered retreat, the calculated sacrifice of entire worlds to slow the enemy advance. She understood the strategic necessity, but understanding did not make it easier to accept. The sirens sound outside, on and on, the Khan continued, his expression darkening like clouds passing over the sun. At Actinus Hive, an hour ago, 10,000 people took their own lives. They sealed a zone of the hive and cut off their own air supply. The last message said they could hear wolves howling in their dreams. There are others, smaller incidents, but multiplying by the hour. Mars has fallen silent. Fire and fear spread without end. He paused, his dark eyes finding hers. "I am called the Warhawk," he said, "but perhaps only because I was given a sky to fly in. My brother Dawn has only ever known cages, duty, honor, strength. And for every bar placed around him by others, he has made those bars stronger. He has made his cages smaller and smaller until to spread his wings would tear him apart." Sukassan felt a chill run through her. The Khan was speaking of things beyond strategy now, beyond the movements of fleets and armies. He was speaking of what this war was doing to those who fought it. "You think he is wrong?" she asked quietly. "No," said the Khan. "I think he is right. But what he is having to do is breaking him." He rose, towering over her, and bowed his head. "He needs to hear the voice that tells him the price, and lets him choose to do as he must. He needs to be allowed the moment of flight before he returns to the cage of necessity." And with that, the Warhawk departed, leaving Sukassan alone with her thoughts and the distant sound of sirens. 3 days after the breach, the first defense sphere had fallen. Pluto was dead, its moons captured or destroyed, its orbital installations reduced to debris, its garrison massacred to the last man. The weapon platforms were gone, cleared by nuclear fire. The minefields were exhausted, triggered by suicide ships that had spent themselves like water against rock. The torpedo shoals had been depleted, their warheads expended against an enemy that seemed to have no end. Sigismund's fleet had withdrawn, fighting every kilometer, bleeding the enemy for every advance. They had killed hundreds of traitor vessels, cruisers and destroyers and assault ships, even a grand cruiser that had tried to run down the Lacrimae and met Sigismund's guns instead. They had fought with a ferocity that would be remembered in songs and sagas, had proved that the defenders of Terra would not break easily. But they had lost more than they had killed. The First Sphere fleet was down to less than half its original strength, and what remained was battered, exhausted, their ammunition depleted and their crews running on nothing but adrenaline and faith. They had been pushed back from Pluto to the orbit of Neptune, and the traitors showed no sign of slowing. During the retreat, Sigismund's flagship was boarded. The fighting was brutal and close, warriors in yellow and black cutting each other apart in corridors too cramped for anything but hate. Sigismund fought through it all, his black sword singing, his movements a dance of death that left traitors broken and bleeding in his wake. He found Horus Aximand, called Little Horus, once one of the Legion's greatest captains, now a twisted reflection of everything he had been, and they duelled amid the wreckage of the command deck. It was Boreas who saved him. The first lieutenant of the Templars led a relief force through the ship, cutting through the enemy to reach their lord. But the price was high. Boreas fell, his armor shattered, his body broken, buying time for Sigismund to escape. The teleport sequence is initiated. Fafnir Rand called over the Vox. "We need to go." Sigismund stood over his fallen brother, blade raised for one final blow against Aximand. In that moment, he saw everything clearly, the weight of his choices, the cost of his faith, the blood that would never stop flowing. The world dissolved in blinding light as the teleporters seized him and pulled him away. Pluto fell 12 hours later. If the battle for Pluto had been a knife fight in the dark, the battle for Uranus was a siege. The planet hung at the edge of the inner system, its orbit a gateway that any attacker must pass to reach Jupiter and Mars beyond. Its 7 moons bristled with fortifications. Its orbital space was crowded with stations and habitats, homes to billions of souls who had lived their entire lives in the shadow of the ice giant's pale blue surface. They called it the Elysian Gate, and it was supposed to be impregnable. The attack came from an unexpected direction. A vast space hulk, the daughter of woe, a mountain of fused vessels and debris that had drifted through the warp for millennia, emerged from unreality directly above the planet's northern pole. It was so massive that the defenders' guns could barely scratch its surface, so dense with twisted metal and corrupted machinery that conventional weapons simply vanished into its bulk. And while every gun in the system turned to face this new threat, the true assault force translated into being behind it. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands. The full strength of the traitor vanguard, held in reserve for this moment, now unleashed in a single devastating strike. The outer defenses fell within 18 hours. Stations that had stood for centuries became funeral pyres for their crews. Habitats that had housed millions became tombs. The moons of Uranus, each one a fortress in its own right, were isolated and assaulted one by one, their garrisons fighting to the last man, their deaths buying time that no one knew how to spend. Lord Jubal Khan, called the Lord of Summer Lightning, commanded the White Scar's forces that guarded the system. He was a legend among Void Warriors, a hunter whose reputation spanned the stars, and he had sworn to hold the Elysian Gate no matter the cost. When the enemy fleet cornered his flagship and boarded it, he met them with blade in hand. Abaddon found him on the bridge. The duel was brief and beautiful, 2 masters of war testing each other, measuring, probing, seeking the opening that would mean death for one and victory for the other. Jubal's Guandao was a ribbon of steel that seemed to be everywhere at once, while Abaddon's sword was a hammer blow that shattered defenses and crushed resistance. In the end, it came down to a single moment of hesitation. Jubal feinted high and struck low, a killing blow that would have eviscerated any lesser warrior. But Abaddon did not defend. He did not retreat. He simply stepped into the blow, accepted the pain as the Guandao's edge kissed his armor, and drove his sword through Jubal's chest. The Lord of Summer Lightning fell, his blood freezing in the vacuum, his legend ending in silence. A worthy opponent, Abaddon said to himself, looking down at the body of his enemy. May you find peace in whatever lies beyond. The Elysian Gate fell 3 days later, and the road to the inner system lay open. Mars fell without a siege. The Red Planet had been the seat of the Mechanicum since before the Emperor had united Terra, its forged cities and temple factories the source of the weapons and machines that had built humanity's domain. For thousands of years, the tech priests had labored in their red-lit sanctums, pursuing knowledge that was equal parts science and mysticism, creating wonders that the rest of humanity could barely comprehend. But Mars had already fallen once, at the beginning of the Heresy. Kel-Bahal, the fabricator general, had thrown in his lot with Horus almost before the betrayal at Istvan. His followers, those who called themselves the Dark Mechanicum, had embraced the powers of chaos with a fervor that terrified even some of the Traitor Legions. They had corrupted the forges, had twisted the machine spirits, had created abominations that defied the laws of physics and sanity alike. For 7 years, the Loyalists had held a portion of the planet, fighting a bitter, sapping war against their corrupted brethren. Camba Diaz, Lord Castellan of the Fourth Sphere, had commanded those forces with patience and skill that bordered on the superhuman. His stone-souled endurance had become legendary, his refusal to retreat inspiring his warriors to hold lines that should have collapsed years ago. Now the Dark Mechanicum's true masters had arrived. 7,000 ships descended on Mars, each one a cathedral of twisted metal and forbidden technology. They came with weapons that turned warships inside out, that rewrote the laws of reality, that drove machine spirits mad with a single pulse of corrupted code. Against such horrors, conventional tactics were meaningless. Camba Diaz fought anyway. His fleet met the enemy above Mars's rust-red surface, guns blazing, shields flaring, warriors dying with oaths on their lips. He was the stone of Inwit, the unyielding wall against which the tide must break. He did not retreat because retreat was not in his nature. He did not surrender because surrender was not in his vocabulary. Break them, he told his warriors as his flagship burned around him. Let them know the cost of their treachery. The Fourth Sphere fleet died above Mars, but they died well. Every ship that fell took enemies with it. Every warrior that perished bought time for the inner system to prepare. When Camba Diaz's cruiser finally succumbed, its reactor breached by concentrated fire, it took 3 enemy vessels with it in a final apocalyptic embrace. Mars belonged to the Dark Mechanicum once more, but the price had been paid in full. While Mars burned, Abaddon took the moon, Luna. Earth's ancient companion, grey and silent, scarred by 1,000,000 years of impacts and 1,000 years of human habitation. It was the cradle of the Space Marines, the place where the gene rights of the Selenar had first perfected the technology that created the Legions. Its vaults held secrets older than the Imperium itself, knowledge that could reshape the galaxy in the right hands. Horus wanted that knowledge. He wanted the Selenar's ability to create new warriors, to replenish his forces faster than battle could consume them. He wanted the moon that had watched over Terra since before humanity had learnt to make fire. The attack was surgical. Abaddon's forces translated directly into Luna's fortress complexes, bypassing the orbital defenses entirely through warp sorcery that cost the lives of thousands of sacrifices. The fighting was fierce but brief. The Selenar were gene rights, not soldiers, and their guardians were caught completely off guard. In the deepest vaults, Abaddon found Heliosa, the Selenar matriarch. She was an ancient thing, her body more machine than flesh, her features hidden behind a helm of silver metal. Around her hummed the devices of her craft, gene looms and spliced mattresses, fat banks and memory cores, the tools that had shaped humanity's defenders for generations. "You should have destroyed this place," Abaddon told her, his voice cold. "You must have known we would come." Heliosa did not answer. "But you couldn't do it, could you? You couldn't let go of the hope that somehow, some way, you might survive this. That's why you bent the knee to the Emperor in the first place, survival. That's why you made us for him." He stepped closer, looming over her small form, the threat implicit in every line of his body. "Now I offer you the same bargain. Live and serve, or die and see everything you've built become ashes." For a long moment, there was silence. The machines hummed. The air recyclers whispered. Somewhere in the distance, gunfire echoed as the last defenders sold their lives. Then Heliosa bowed her head. "The Selenar will serve," she said, her voice like rustling parchment. "What is the will of the Warmaster?" Abaddon smiled, not with pleasure, but with satisfaction. Another piece moved into place, another step toward victory. "Build us warriors, matriarch," he said, turning to leave. "Build us legions." And then came Samus. It emerged from the warp in the space around the Phalanx, Rogel Dawn's mighty flagship, summoned by the fears and hatreds of 1,000,000 dying souls. It wore many forms, a wolf with silver fur, a shadow with too many limbs, a man whose face shifted between every horror that humanity had ever imagined. It came with demons at its back, entities that tore through the ship's defenders like fire through parchment. But its true weapon was not strength. It was Mercedes Oleton. The daemon had been patient. It had watched her for years, had fed on her memories of the vengeful spirit, had grown fat on her nightmares of wolves and blood and the sound of Horus's voice. Now, as her refugee ship approached Jupiter's defense sphere, it reached through the crack in her soul and claimed her. Mercedes felt herself drowning in darkness. She felt the daemon's presence fill her mind, pushing her awareness down into a small corner where she could only watch as her body moved without her consent. She felt her memories become weapons, reshaping the daemon's essence into forms drawn from her own past. The things that attacked the Phalanx wore the faces of people she had known. The daemons that stalked the corridors laughed with voices she recognized. The horror that confronted Rogel Dawn himself looked at him through eyes that had once belonged to a remembrancer named Ignace Carcassy. But Mercedes was a remembrancer too. Her purpose had always been to see, to remember, to hold on to the truth. And the truth she held now was this: she was not just a victim. She was not just a weapon. She was a person, with a will and a choice. When the daemon tried to use her body to kill Loken Gaviel Loken, the knight-errant who had once been her friend, she fought back. It was not a physical struggle. She had no physical strength, no psychic power, no weapon that could harm a creature of the warp. All she had was her will, her memories, her absolute refusal to let this thing define what she was. And somehow, impossibly, it was enough. She turned on the daemon with Loken's own sword, driven by a fury that came from somewhere deeper than fear. She struck at the shadow that had worn her face, that had spoken with her voice, that had tried to make her an instrument of humanity's destruction. The daemon screamed and dissolved, and Mercedes Oleton collapsed, blood streaming from her eyes, her body broken by the strain of what she had done, but still alive, still human, still her own. On the 13th day of Secundus, the first shells fell on Terra. Rogel Dawn stood on a landing platform in the Imperial Palace and watched the sky burn. Ships were everywhere, enemy vessels descending through the atmosphere like drops of blood falling into water, their guns blazing, their holds full of warriors eager to spill loyal blood. Above them, the orbital defenses fired without cease, their lances and macro cannons turning the heavens into a cauldron of destruction. The sirens that had wailed for 6 weeks rose to a new pitch. This was not warning anymore. This was announcement. The enemy was here, was now, was at the gates. Around dawn, his sons moved with purpose. Imperial fists in yellow and black formed up in their companies, their faces grim beneath their helms. Sigismund was there, his black sword in hand, his eyes fixed on the falling ships with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Fafnir Ran marshaled the assault companies, his axes ready, his shield raised. Thousands of warriors, the best the 7th Legion had to offer, prepared to meet the enemy. The walls of heaven have fallen. Dawn had told Admiral Sukassan just hours before. Now we defend the walls of Earth. The Phalanx was gone, dispatched to the outer system to continue the guerrilla war, to harry the enemy's supply lines and slow their advance. It was a bitter necessity, sending away his greatest asset when the enemy was at the door. But Dawn understood necessity. He had built his entire life around it. He looked at the sky one more time. Somewhere up there, beyond the fire and the death, Horus was waiting, his brother, his enemy, the son who had loved their father once, and now sought only his destruction. "Let him come," Dawn said, his voice low and hard. "Let them all come. Terra will not fall, not while I stand." He turned and walked into the palace, toward the war that would determine humanity's fate. In the forest of dead trees, the fire had almost gone out. The Emperor sat alone beside the embers, his form that of an old man, weary beyond measure, his eyes black wells that reflected no light. Around him, the darkness pressed close, shapes of fur and scale and bone, the servants of the dark gods, waiting for the moment when the last flame flickered and died. Horus stood on the other side of the dying fire, his form vast and terrible, more shadow than substance now, more god than man. The gems on his fingers, amethyst, ruby, emerald, sapphire, glowed with their own inner light, the colors of the powers he served. "Here we are at last," Horus said, his voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Will you not speak now, Father? Will you not tell me the truth?" The Emperor did not answer. "I have seen everything," Horus continued. "I know what you are, a tyrant, a deceiver. You built your throne on lies and slaughter, and you maintained it by force. Higher purpose, greater ends, just pretty words to disguise the skull beneath." Still the Emperor was silent. Horus reached into the fire and closed his fist around a glowing ember. The heat died in his grasp, becoming cold ash, becoming nothing. "You still have some strength," he said, rising to his full height, his presence stretching up into the naked branches and the starless sky. "But you are not strong enough. You never were." The Emperor raised his head. His eyes, those black, depthless wells, met his son's gaze without flinching. "I see you," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of millennia, the grief of a father who had watched his sons destroy everything he had built for them. "I see what you have become, and I see what waits beyond you." The fire flared for an instant, a last surge of defiance against the consuming dark, but it was weaker than before, smaller. The shadows did not retreat as far, and when the light faded, they were closer than they had ever been. "Run," Horus called after him, as the vision faded and the warp dissolved into chaos. "Run, Father, and know that I am coming. Run." The Emperor closed his eyes and said nothing, and prepared for the siege to come. And so the solar war ends, not with victory or defeat, but with the promise of worse to come. The outer system had fallen. Mars and Luna were in enemy hands. The fleets that had guarded humanity's birthplace were scattered or destroyed, their survivors fleeing to fight another day or rushing home to defend the last bastion. Billions had died already, and billions more would follow. But Terra still stood. The palace still stood. The Emperor still sat upon his golden throne, holding back the darkness with the sheer force of his will. And Rogel Dawn still walked the walls, preparing his defenses, knowing that the true test was yet to come. The Siege of Terra was about to begin. Sleep now, if you can. Let the sound of my voice carry you away from the troubles of your own day, to a time when the troubles were greater but the heroes were greater still. Dream of golden walls and ancient banners, of warriors who stood against the night because that was what warriors did. And remember, as you drift towards sleep, that even in the darkest hour, even when the wolves are howling at the gate, there are those who do not yield. There are those who stand firm against the darkness, not because they are certain of victory, but because standing is what they were made to do. For the Emperor, for Terra, for humanity.